everybody. Good afternoon. It is wonderful to see you all out here at our annual gathering of readers and writers. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Robin Eidsmoe, and I always say I get to be the executive director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Thank you so much. It's a privilege. I want to welcome our presenters, moderators, and advisors, and all of you who are here to enjoy the spectacular western beauty of Sun Valley. I also want to give a big hello to those who are attending our live watch party at the Argus Theater. Hi, guys. Love to have you. We have students, teachers, and librarians attending as our complimentary guests. And welcome. And we are live streaming to those who can listen from anywhere in the world, and also to the Opera House this year, where we have air conditioning and closed captioning. So if you need it, go for it. I'd like to introduce you to a few people that you're going to want to get to know this weekend. He is the author of novels and screenplays and an editor-at-large at Penguin Random House. Please welcome John Burnham Schwartz. And most of all, he's our literary director, and he directs our programming and everything all through the year. We couldn't do it without him. The writer and broadcast journalist Ann Taylor Fleming. Where are you, Annie? Okay. Has been part of our family from the very beginning, and she rides shotgun with John. And I'd like you to say hello to our board chair and programming compatriot, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Liaquat Hammond. We are on campus all weekend, and we really do love to hear what you have to say. So don't be shy and tell us how we're doing. So, over the next 3 days, how will all this go? What will we have learned and felt by Tuesday? And is it possible that in this cathedral of a place, in the company of friends and each other, and in some cases family, that we may discover things in our own characters by exploring the characters that are arrayed before us? When Dr. Vivek Murthy talks about an epidemic of loneliness in this country, he also shines a light on our own feelings of digital disconnect. And he charts a course for us to counteract such feelings. And he would say that a gathering such as this together is one of the very paths that we could take. From Edward Luce, yes, very much so. From Edward Luce on Big Nose Brzezinski and Max Boot on Ronald Reagan, we come away with a deeper understanding of ambition and the meaning of dedication, and how one's connection to a place of birth, to a mother, a father, a family, are the underlying influences to shape the people we are to become. Compassion, endurance, unexpected kindness. These are the qualities rarely more vividly revealed than in the work of Jonathan Blitzer, Ocean Vuong, Colin McCann, Eliza Griffiths. So as we listen together, we can enjoy the wonder part of our theme, Words and Wonder. Let us open ourselves up to those things that pull us together, not those things that tear us apart. Let these writers, yes, let these writers teach us about how fiction helps us build empathy, and how memoir in biography motivate and enlighten us, and how laughter, oh yeah, the tonic of laughter, can heal us and boost us. So what do you say? Shall we give it a whirl? Great. Great. So excited to go on this trip with you. Now, I promise I will get off the stage, but just give me another minute to indulge one of the great pleasures I have, and that is to introduce my personal literary hero, Doris Kearns Goodwin. I can say, yes, yeah. I can say that I don't really know Doris personally that well, but I can also say that I do. And I do because for my entire adult life, she has been a spiritual, biographical, historical muse to me. And when I want to feel the comfort of family and small town living, I page through Wait Till Next Year, and I am transported to her childhood in Rockville Center, New York, her closeness to her father, and her passion for the 1950s Brooklyn Dodgers. I read some part of Eleanor and Franklin every single year. I'm inspired by her portrayal of these two outsized, wholly realized human beings as she captures them on their pages. You know, she stood on our big stage, little stage maybe, in the symphony tent almost 20 years ago and talked about her majestic bio of Abraham Lincoln in Team of Rivals. And most recently, she comes around to what is the most personal of her works, her shared life with the speechwriter Dick Goodwin in the 1960s. As always, she has this ability to evoke place, to take us into that windowless office in the White House, where Dick literally created the template for the Great Society. Or we stand next to him as he stood next to Bobby Kennedy in apartheid South Africa as Bobby delivers the words of Dick's speech. Doris charts the course of her life with Dick and does not flinch from the pathos of accompanying her soulmate, inspiration, and contrarian in his final dying days. It's just incredibly moving. You know, it's one thing to have a writer give you the enormous bliss of escape and absorption, but it's a whole nother thing to have them give you life lessons that are infused with hope and optimism to carry you through loss and difficult times. We could not be happier than to host Doris at our 2025 festival. Please join me in offering her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. There's nowhere I would rather be than with all of you today. You who have come here because you love books. This shared experience, I think, is contagious. It fills this place of haunting beauty with a special warmth. And there's no book I'd rather be talking about than An Unfinished Love Story. It matters to me emotionally more than any other book I have written in my long career, perhaps because it really is a story of the last adventure that I took with my late husband, Richard Goodwin. That adventure began one summer morning, several months after my husband had turned 80 years old. He always made a commotion when he came down the stairs every morning. Our routine was that I would wake up at 5:30 so I could have 2 or 2.5 precious hours without him coming down the stairs, because he always announced himself when he came. It was time for breakfast. But this morning he came down and he was singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning." So I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, the time has come." And I knew what he meant. Then he went into "It's Now or Never" from Elvis. the 300 boxes that we'd schlepped around for our entire married life. They say you bring baggage with any relationship. He did indeed. He was like Zelig. He was everywhere in the late 50s through the 60s. Harvard Law Review, first in his class, editor of the Law Review, clerk for Justice Frankfurter, investigator of the rigged television quiz shows, JFK's campaign, JFK's White House, and then the chief speechwriter for LBJ, turned against the war, was with Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire, and then went to Bobby Kennedy, his close friend, was in his campaign, and was with him when he died in Los Angeles. I've looked inside these boxes, of course, during this time, peeked in them, and he had saved everything, letters and diaries and drafts of speeches, memos to presidents, newspaper clippings. For me as an historian, it was incredibly exciting to go through them, I thought. But he had resisted. The end of the 60s, the deaths of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the campus violence, the race riots in the cities were so sad to him that he did not want to look back. He only wanted to look ahead. But finally, evidently, he was ready at this moment. He said, this is the way he talked, "If I've any wisdom to dispense, I better start dispensing now. I'm getting old." So we made a deal that every weekend we would go through the boxes and we'd start from the beginning, not knowing what was going to happen next, not knowing that when we went through JFK's campaign or White House that he would die in 63, not knowing Lyndon Johnson would go to the war, not knowing Bobby Kennedy would die. It was sort of a mini version of all the research I'd done all my years trying to bring dead presidents back to life. Lyndon Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, or FDR. I called them my guys because I lived with them so long. It took me longer to write about the Civil War than the war to be fought. It took me twice as long to write about World War II as that war to be fought. So I really did think of them as my guys. My kids remember once when I was in my study, I was talking to Franklin and Eleanor. I would talk to them. I was asking them questions. I was saying to Eleanor, just forget that he had that affair so many years ago. He loves you and he needs you. And I'd say to Franklin, just be kinder to her. There's still a hurt that's there. And they wonder, what is going on in this study? But now, for the first time, I had my guy. It was really my guy, the only man I lived with more than my 4 other guys. And he was sitting right across from me, answering my questions and arguing with me, which the other guys didn't do. So when we began, I always wondered, what was he like when he was a young man? He was 12 years older than me, and I always wondered, would I have fallen in love with him if I met him when I was younger? Well, the answer was partly provided by 50 letters that he wrote to his best friend, George, who he was in college with at Tufts, and George gave them back to us before he died, and 100 letters that he wrote to his parents when he was in the Army. Letters are the greatest source for a biographer. You feel like you're looking over the shoulder of the person who read it, and you're really feeling the emotion of the moment. I don't know what's going to happen hundreds of years from now when we don't have letters the same way we did before. And as I read these letters to George, I said to myself, yeah, I would have fallen in love with this guy. He was funny, he was warm, he was self-deprecating, he was brilliant, if sometimes rather arrogant. The letters from the Harvard Law School were just priceless. He talked about the practice exams the first year where the dean assured them, don't worry about it, only 7 had to be hospitalized last year. That was a good record. Maybe you'll beat that record. And then he writes a letter to George the day he found out his grades in the summer for the first real year. He said, I'm in shock. I'm straight A's. I'm first in my class. Euphoria, euphoria. Then there's letters after he gets elected to the Law Review where he talks very arrogantly about being flown around from one law school to one law firm to another, all of them wanting him to go there. Or I could take, he said, a scholarship to go to Europe, or I could clerk for a justice on the Supreme Court. It's a terrible burden of choice. Burden of choice, because then I came right after that on a picture of his law review. There are 50 people. There are only 2 women, one on the right, one on the left. One is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She could not even get an interview for a job. So I went storming into his office. This is terrible. He says, it's not my fault. I didn't do it. And then the interesting thing, it was another woman there, Nancy Boxley, and I decided, I wonder what happened to her. So I went out to interview her in California. She was in her mid-80s. Unlike Ruth, she did get a job because she wasn't married. She didn't have a child, as Ruth did. She went to Simpson Thatcher. But then after she got married and got pregnant, they let her go. They said, it's not that we're embarrassed by this situation of the stomach sticking out, but our clients might feel uncomfortable. Well, her career finally resumed, and she went back to her 20th anniversary at Harvard Law School, and she went to an old contracts class, and her teacher in the class was a young woman who was wearing a short dress and boots and very, very pregnant. So progress had been made. So As we approached the JFK boxes, however, I felt a sense of foreboding. We were on different sides of the fault line between JFK and LBJ. In his 20s, Dick had developed that lifelong loyalty to the Kennedys, an enchanted memory of a time when he was a young man in the White House, as well as his close friendships with Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. While in my 20s, the chance to work with Lyndon Johnson in the White House and help him on his memoirs had left me with a loyalty and empathy for LBJ. So the tremors from this LBJ-JFK division really ran through our marriage. It looks back now, it really wasn't fun. Our arguments were maybe scholastic, but they were more than that. They were emotional. I would constantly argue, it took LBJ to pass all of JFK's legislation. He wouldn't have gotten any of it through. And he would argue, but no, he inspired the country. LBJ wouldn't have gotten through without what he did. And of course, we were both right. You know, he would argue the war in Vietnam might have ended earlier. I would say, you can't know that. And so as we approached these boxes, we decided we would set some ground rules. We would start with our first impressions and see how they changed over time. A clean slate, as I said, not knowing what would come next. So we actually stood up and shook hands as if we were going to a prize fight. And then we burst out laughing at our own idiocy. So we relived the early days of the JFK campaign and the administration, and I came to a greater understanding and appreciation for JFK. I followed Dick as he followed JFK on the Caroline. They flew on this private plane that JFK's father had gotten for them that served as an office during the day and sleeping quarters at night. So it was a much more intimate experience than many campaigns might be today. And I saw the campaign through Dick's eyes as he witnessed the growth of JFK as a candidate. He wasn't a great speaker at first, Dick said. He just spoke too fast. I shouldn't talk. I'll speak slowly. He did not let his points come through. He looked like a student giving a report. He couldn't wait to go back to his seat. But then after a while, he would ask the reporters, how did I do? Where did I lose them? Where did it work well? And he got to be a really good speaker. I was witness as I followed him there to the birth of the Peace Corps at the University of Michigan. He was flying to Ann Arbor with the whole plane that night simply to sleep at the Union at University of Michigan and take a whistle-stop tour the next day at the University of Michigan. He arrived at 2 a.m. There were 10,000 kids waiting for him. So we realized, oh, my God, I haven't got a speech prepared. And meanwhile, Dick and Ted Sorensen had gone off to a 24-hour cafeteria to get something to eat. So we decided I better speak extemporaneously. So he simply asked the kids a series of questions. How many of you are going to be doctors? You might be willing to go to Ghana for a year or two. How many who are going to be engineers or teachers might be willing to go overseas and show people overseas what America is really all about? I think college, he said, should mean something more than giving an advantage economically to the graduates. It should mean, hopefully, providing a purpose in life. It was only 3 minutes, the speech. He said it was the longest short speech he had ever given, but somehow he had set a fire on those kids. 2 graduate students started a petition. There was no Peace Corps yet at the moment. 2 graduate students started a petition pledging that they would give 2 years of their life to volunteer for America somewhere abroad. That petition was signed by 1,000 kids in the matter of days and sent to Dick and Ted, who then fashioned a new speech for Kennedy, and that is when the Peace Corps was born, in that speech. So to be able to live through that experience and to know that it really came from the kids themselves. That was the magic of a contagion of leadership that set something afire in the kids. So I asked him I could ask him questions too. I said, what do you remember about the inauguration? Well, what he remembered was not so much the speech as the fact that it was so bloody cold. And you could not wear an overcoat because John Kennedy wasn't wearing an overcoat, so none of them could wear an overcoat. And then they had to sit through this endless parade, 72 bands, 32,000 marchers. He thought it would never end. When it finally ended, he went into the West Wing to inspect his digs. He would never have seen his office yet until this moment. And who else was in there inspecting his own new digs but John Kennedy, the new president? So he encountered Kennedy, and Kennedy said to him, Dick, did you see the Coast Guard contingent? Dick said, I couldn't remember one contingent from the other. He just stood there blankly. Kennedy said, there wasn't a black face among them. This isn't right. We have to do something about it. This was his first assignment, his first mission in the new government. He was so excited, he ran up to his office, and he thought, uh-oh, where is the Coast Guard? Is it in the Defense Department? Is it in the Treasury Department? Who was the secretary? Turns out it was Treasury and Secretary Dillon. He called him. Immediately that next day, they started a study and confirmed, yes, there had no black graduate in the Coast Guard contingent, so in the Coast Guard itself. So they had a recruitment drive, and they found a terrific trailblazer named Merle Smith, whose picture is in the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. And I got to interview his widow about what it was like to be a trailblazer, the only black at certain points in time. So that was an incredible beginning of Dick's career that day, the excitement of being a young person making something happen. Then the boxes we uncovered had his work to do with Jackie Kennedy. He came up with a number of ideas. He worked with her on saving the Egyptian monuments from the Aswan Dam flooding. And he came up for an idea. Let's have a dinner, he said, celebrating the winners of the Nobel Prize and the Pulitzer Prizes to show young people what excellence and hard work can do. And because it was his idea, he got to escort Jackie to the glittering evening. He looks like he's just won the lottery, does he not, in this thing? There he is with this beautiful woman, violins playing on the side, and it goes to the dinner that is called A Night in Camelot. This is where JFK quipped that this is the most extraordinary assemblage of talent ever assembled in this room since the night that Thomas Jefferson dined alone. So as we went through the boxes, we realized that we were often in the same place at the same time, though we never had quite met. Though Dick said to me, and I loved him saying that, he was actually always looking for me all those years until he finally found me. We were together at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. I was an intern at the State Department. He was with his friend Bill Moyers at the Peace Corps that day. I was there. He was there. He said, I saw you there. I doubt that he saw me there. There were 250,000 other people who were there. But I still remember the excitement. We were all gathered at the Washington Memorial to march up to the Lincoln Memorial. I was carrying a sign, Catholics, Jews, and Protestants unite for civil rights. And even more important and more memorable than Martin Luther King's extraordinary speech was the moment when we all clasped hands and sung, "We Shall Overcome Together." It was the most joyful day of my young public life and changed the direction of what might have been my career. I was studying international relations at college. I'd studied French and Russian, won a Fulbright to go to Brussels and Paris after I graduated. But now I only wanted to stay home in America and join what was happening in America, the civil rights movement. Well, only 3 months later, John Kennedy was assassinated, and Dick was part of the small team that prepared for the funeral. It was he who had to get the eternal flame that Jackie wanted to be at the gravesite so that the little boy would never have a light put out when he was asleep. A few months after the funeral, Dick crossed the fault line to work in the Johnson White House. We never knew exactly what it was that caused LBJ to call him over to be a speechwriter until we found a tape that revealed the origin of LBJ's invitation to join the White House staff. How splendid Dick said it was to be like a fly on the wall and listen to Lyndon Johnson. The conversation was so great. He says to Bill Moyers, I need somebody who can put rhythm into my speeches. I need somebody who can put great Churchillian phrases into my speeches. I need someone who can put sex into my speeches. What he meant by that, I have no idea. And then Moyer says, well, the only one I know is Dick Goodwin, but he's not one of us. There was a fault line between the Kennedys and the Johnsons. But Johnson said, that's all right, let's try him out. They tried him out on a poverty message. They liked it, and he stayed in the White House. So then there's the origin of the Great Society that he was right in the middle of. One morning, Moyers called him and said, the president wants us to come and talk to him about an LBJ program, his own program, not John Kennedy's anymore. The civil rights bill that was John Kennedy's was getting through the Congress, and he'd already passed the tax cut, which was one of Kennedy's major programs. So now he wanted an LBJ program. So Dick said, so we're going to meet him in the Oval Office? No, we're going to the White House pool, he said. So they get to the White House pool, and they find a naked LBJ swimming up and down the pool, side-stroking. Dick said he looked like a giant whale. They're all standing on the side in their suit and ties, and Johnson said, well, come on in, guys, hurry up. So they have no choice but to strip naked as well. So now you have 3 naked guys swimming in the pool. And Johnson finally pulls over to the sign, and he starts talking. And what's already on his mind is, this is what I want for my Johnson program. I want Medicare. I want Medicaid. I want aid to education. I want Head Start. I want aid to the city. I want aid to the countrysides. And he said, we need a speech where I can lay out the program. So they decide they'll go to the University of Michigan, a little chutzpah to go to the same place where the Peace Corps had taken place, on May 22nd as a graduation. That gives it a deadline for getting this speech together. All the programs have to be get together, and they needed a name. They didn't have a name. So some people wanted a glorious society, some people wanted a splendid society, some people wanted a good society. But Dick tried out in smaller speeches a great society, several times a great society, and it finally caught on. So that is how the Great Society was born, in a pool with 3 naked guys swimming around for half an hour. But in that speech, like JFK, he challenged the generation who were there, the college kids, but this time it was challenging the generation of the most affluent country on the face of the earth to help alleviate the crushing weight of poverty, to help alleviate racial injustice. How I wish we could come back to those values today. Now, the reaction was so positive that Dick was drawn into the inner circle. He had drinks in that little sitting room right next to the Oval Office where he would read the reviews out loud. Everything was saying it was great, it was great. So he said to Dick, "You'll be my voice, you'll be my Harry Hopkins." He soon learned the truth, however, of what Bill Moyers once said, that LBJ was 13 of the most complex people you will ever meet. Because word leaked, not from Dick, from another speechwriter, that he had worked on the Great Society speech. And Hugh Sidey came wanting to write a story about this young Dick Goodwin, who was now working as a speechwriter. Johnson never wanted anybody to be told as he'd written any speech, so he said he never wrote a word of that speech. Maybe he did a little research, maybe a little bit, but no, not a word. Then he pulled out a chart, and he said, "Here's the chart of my White House staff," and underneath was miscellaneous, and there was Dick Goodman, not even Goodwin. It was so hurtful to Dick. He was so embarrassed. I said, "Well, how did you deal with this?" He said, "Well, I was called in minutes later to work on a signing statement for the Civil Rights Bill, which had passed with Lyndon Johnson's great leadership through the Senate that summer, and after the filibuster was broken. So how could I not want to be there? Overnight, 78 years of Jim Crow legislation was brought to an end. He was so large of a figure." And then minutes later, he would be praising him all over again. And that success of the Civil Rights Bill helped to lead the '64 campaign and the magical year of the Great Society, when all the legislation was passed: Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, National Foundation of the Arts, NPR, PBS, which is under assault today. There it was in its very beginning, in its glorious 50, 60 years that we've had since then. And we better get sure till we can figure out how to make it stay alive. But then, the most extraordinary moment, I think, in Dick's public life was helping Lyndon Johnson on the speech that he gave after the Selma demonstrations in 1965. Johnson had planned to wait until 1966 to introduce voting rights because he thought the country needed to absorb the Civil Rights Act. So much would be changing. But Bloody Sunday changed all that. When Martin Luther King led his marchers on a protest march about the blacks being unable to register to vote throughout the South, and was met by the Alabama state troopers, a peaceful marcher. They came over them with their horses and billy clubs and whips, all of it captured on television. I was in graduate student school at the time. We were all watching this. We couldn't believe this was our America. I joined protesters in the street in Cambridge and Boston. All of a sudden, Johnson decided that he'd better speak out about voting rights, even if he'd been planning to do it. He was able to pivot. So he decided on a Sunday night to speak that next Monday night to a joint session of Congress on the need for voting rights. Dick happened not to be in the White House that Sunday night. He was at dinner at Arthur Schlesinger, the historian's house. So the speech was assigned to a different aide. When Dick came in the morning at 9 a.m., Johnson said, "How's Dick doing on the speech?" And he exploded. "What?" When he found out it wasn't given to him. "You get him to write it right away." So he had only 9 hours to write that speech. They asked him, "Oh, what do you need? What do you need?" He said, "Well, I need serenity. I will turn out the pages little by little with my secretary, but nobody can come in here. Nobody can say a word to me." He then took off his wristwatch and put it in a drawer, as if by hiding the watch away, he was hiding time away. And he knew that the opening lines would be the most important. They took him almost 2 hours to write. It started out in such an extraordinary way. He talked about the fact that every now and then history and fate meet at a certain time in a certain place. So it was in Lexington and Concord. So it was in Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama, which meant he was setting Selma, Alabama in the light of the great historic moments in our history. And then he said, There's no Negro problem. There is no white problem. There is no Northern problem. There is no Southern problem. There is only an American problem. And we are met here tonight, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, to meet that problem. Finally, when he got that part through, he went out to take a break and smoke his cigar. And in the distance, he heard young kids singing, "We Shall Overcome." So he came back in, and then he wrote the passage for which the speech is named, that even if we get the Civil Rights Bill through, we have 100 years of oppression to overcome. But if we work together, and then he said very slowly the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement, "We shall overcome." At that moment, the people stood up crying, stomping ovations, knowing that the anthem of the movement, which was the outside movement pressuring the inside, had been brought to the highest chambers of power. It was said that Martin Luther King cried at that moment because he knew that this means the voting rights bill would get through. But that wasn't all. He had one more thing Johnson wanted to say. Right before it was almost ready to go over to the joint session, to the Congress, he said to Dick, in very soft language, Dick, he called him up. He said, only person to bother him the whole day. He said, I'd like to talk about Cthulhu. Dick knew what that meant. And he said it was the softest Lyndon Johnson had ever spoken to him in the whole time he ever knew him. He said, I'd like to talk. Could you put something in about Cthulhu? What it meant was that LBJ had gone to a small Mexican-American community in the middle of his college career as a teacher. He was at Southwest State Teacher College to work for a year to make money to continue on. And he saw the pain of prejudice on the kids' faces, the Mexican-American kids, when they came to school. They had no food. They hadn't eaten. They had a sense that people didn't like them, and they didn't know why. He said, I want to talk about that. So what he brings is a great passage for him, saying, in 1928, when I was there was so little I could do. I gave part of my first salary to get soccer balls, baseball. I gave everything I could, but there wasn't much. But now it's 1965. And I'm here as President of the United States, and I have power, and I intend to use it for this. And again, the audience broke out because he'd made himself vulnerable. And the extraordinary and most important thing was that 4 months later, the Voting Rights Act passed. And we got a picture of Dick getting one of the pens when he signed the bill with all these pens that hung on his study wall and is now on my study wall in Boston itself. So when Dick was standing at the well of the House that night, he said, God, how I loved LBJ that night. Never could I have imagined that 2 years later I would be marching in the streets against him. Nor could I have imagined when I watched that speech with my friends in graduate school that night that 10 years later I would meet and marry the man who helped to craft those words, or that 2 years later I'd be working for this president who delivered that speech so extraordinarily. So it is here in 1967 and 1968 that my little story gets finally woven into LBJ's story. When I was selected as a White House fellow, we had a big dance in the White House that night. He did dance with me. It wasn't that peculiar. There were only 3 women out of the 16 White House fellows. But as he whirled me around the floor, he whispered that he wanted me to be assigned directly to him in the White House. But it was not to be that simple. For in the months leading up to my selection, like many young people, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. And a friend of mine and I had written an article against Lyndon Johnson, against the war in Vietnam, which we'd sent to the New Republic. And we hadn't heard anything. We weren't published authors until, it turned out, 2 days after the dance, somehow some of the movement of the dance had come through. They decided to publish it with their title, How to Remove Lyndon Johnson in 1968. So I was certain that he would kick me out of the program. But instead, surprisingly, he said, bring her down here for a year. And if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did eventually end up working for him in the White House and then accompanying to his ranch, as was said, to help him on his memoirs. I'll never forget my first time at the ranch on Memorial Day in 1968. It set the tone for all my later visits. No matter where we were, in the pool, though we were not naked, I promise you, walking by the river, at meals, watching television, he talked. He never stopped talking. He talked and he talks. I sometimes wondered why he had chosen me to spend so many hours to talk with. He wanted to talk about the days when he was young, a young FDR aficionado, getting rural electricity to his beloved hill country. He wanted to talk about civil rights and voting rights. They were luckily the 2 chapters I was working on the memoirs. And I'd like to believe I was there because I was a good listener. But also I thought it was partly because I was from Harvard, and he had a thing about Harvard. His father used to tell him, if you brush up against the grindstone of life, you'll have more polish than any Harvard or Yale man ever had. But he said somehow I could never believe him. But I also worried that part of it was that I was then a young woman, and he had somewhat of a reputation, so I was constantly chattering to him about steady boyfriends, even when I had no boyfriends at all. And everything was working perfectly until one day he said he wanted to discuss our relationship, which sounded rather ominous. He took me to a lake, conveniently called Lake Lyndon Johnson, and there was wine and cheese and a red check tablecloth, all the romantic trappings. And he started out, Doris, more than any other woman I have ever known, and my heart sank. And then he said, you remind me of my mother. It was pretty embarrassing given what was going on in my mind. Well, in the fall of 1968, as his presidency was winding to a close, he began pressuring me to come and live in Texas and be part of that small team working on the memoirs. He said he'd get me an apartment in Austin during the week and I could spend the weekends at the ranch. I told him I'd love to go, but I hoped I could do it part-time because I really wanted to go back to Harvard to start teaching, my teaching career, and I'd come on long weekends, I'll come on vacations, I'll come in the summers. He said, no, it's all or nothing. It's all or nothing. I realize now if I hadn't done it, my life would have been different. I had heard of his bullying treatment when pressuring others to give way. When Dick was ready to leave in the fall of 1965 to accept a writing fellowship at Wesleyan, Lyndon Johnson threatened to draft him. He showed him a law that allowed presidents to induct specialists of vital interest. But with me, initially, it was really a series of incentives. You want to teach? I'll get you a position at the University of Texas. Hell, you want to teach about the presidency? I'm a president, for God's sakes. Now, what could be better than that? Oh, you want to be a writer? I'll get you a cabin on the lake with blue skies. Isn't that what you writers like? You could go anytime you want. You could go as long as you're not working, as long as you're working with me all the time. But when I was with him over the Christmas holidays in 1968, the last visit when I was there as he was president, I still had not agreed to come full time. And then he turned against me. Not by yelling, not by humiliating me, but by icing me out. That's what he did. He simply ignored me. We'd be in a room with people. He wouldn't look to me. He would never address me. He would never talk to me. I later learned that that's what his mother did to him when he was young. Lady Bird, his incredible anchor, came to my rescue. She could always smooth ruffled feelings. She told me, don't be upset. His mood will pass. I know it will. And obviously, she must have spoken to him. For minutes later, he came over to me and said, hey, you want to go in the pool? I'm ready to go in the pool. But still, our impasse about all or nothing had not been worked out until the last day of his presidency. He called me into his Oval Office, and he was seated at his desk. He was going to be leaving the next day, and as I walked in, he simply said to me, all right, part-time. I need help, he said then, more vulnerably. Will you help me? Of course I will, I said. I had planned, as I'd hoped, to come down on long weekends. He said, come down as soon as you can, but take care of yourself up there at Harvard. Don't let their hatred for LBJ poison your feelings for me. And then as I left, he called me back for a minute. He said, you know, it's not easy to get all the help you want when you're no longer on top of the world. I won't forget what you're doing for me. Nor would I forget the role that Lady Bird had played in persuading LBJ to accept me working part-time. In the years before she died, she was an extraordinary woman, and I valued so much what her friendship had meant. She suffered a series of strokes that left her unable to speak, and when macular degenera prevented her from reading, she turned to audiobooks. So she had listened to Lyndon Johnson. She listened to Abraham Lincoln, the Team of Rivals. And Lucy called me up to say she had just finished listening to the tape, and she wanted me to know how much she loved it. I couldn't imagine what could happen, but Lucy said, just wait and listen. And then after a long pause, I heard her clapping and clapping, softly at first. And then I asked Lucy, can you tell me when I was going to write this, do I have this right? And she said, oh, yes, she's so dramatic. She clapped softly, and then she rose in intensity. She wanted you to know you were part of our family again. And I did indeed feel that I had been part of the family again. I remember seeing Lucy at a premiere of the HBO film on LBJ in Austin. She had asked me to come and I was there. And she asked me when we were in the cloakroom, did Dick ever forgive Daddy? And I was so glad to say that he had come a long, long way. Indeed, after we finished up the boxes for 1964 and 1965, we stayed up one night, all night talking. Oh, my God, he said, I'm feeling affection for the old guy again. It seemed like years of anger had melted away, and he had come to a deeper understanding of the role that JFK may have set in setting the tone for the decade, but that LBJ had done in getting everything that is all around us happening to become a law. We both came to an understanding together that JFK and LBJ were forever intertwined in history, their legacies more powerfully influential than either one had been left alone. So before Dick was diagnosed with the cancer, he had come to some sort of healing process about LBJ, which made him really happier. There had been a depression that had lingered over him throughout his life. There was a moment when he wrote a letter to George, his friend, when we found that sense of him saying that he was cheerful all the time. He'd met these young girls, and he was at a great restaurant where there was a beautiful inverted wine. He would never forget that day. He was crying. It was so beautiful. I thought, this is not the Dick I knew. I'd known one who was sad for much of his life. And somehow I think it had to do with the deaths that had happened. His first wife had died, LBJ had died later, and JFK had died, and Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And he felt like his career had been stopped short, and he hadn't been able to do all the things he wanted to do. But now as we went through these boxes, he had a sense of fulfillment that maybe he had made a difference. And it meant that that last year of his life, even as he had cancer, was in many ways one of the happiest years of his life. He used to say as we went through the boxes, who would you bet on? Who will be finished first, me or the boxes? And in fact, working on the boxes gave him a sense of purpose, a joy in waking up every day, a reconciliation, as I say, with the past, a lifting of that depression that had shadowed him, a feeling that he had made a difference. And I realize now that we were both in the grip of a fantasy. So long as we continued going through the boxes, his life, my life, and our lives together, we believed would continue. I realize now that I fell in love with him a third time during that last year. The first time when I met him, the first night I fell in love with him, I knew it was the man I wanted to marry. The second time when I read those letters to George, I would have fallen in love with him then. And now the third time when he handled his cancer with such extraordinary grace. As the relentless disease took its course, however, he asked me to promise that I would finish what we had begun together. When he finally died, I felt his terrible weight and responsibility. I had made a promise to him, but I worried that it would just make me too sad to continue without him. At the same time, I was preoccupied with the decision of what to do about our big old house that had been our home. It really had become a home of books. How I loved that house. 10,000 books were spread through every room. We had even transformed a 3-car garage into a library with a tower inspired by Dick's love of Galileo, about whom he'd written a poem that was put on in England and in Boston. And in fact, one whole wall was Lincoln in that garage. An article was written, Lincoln is at a garage at a library. But no matter where I found myself, I was submerged in loneliness. Every room had books that we'd created. I felt Dick's absence, waking up in bed, making breakfast downstairs, waiting for him to come down the stairs. I decided that I could not stay there and put our house on the market and decided to move into Boston. When my mother died when I was only 15, my father made a similar decision to move to an apartment. He was heartbroken, he said. He couldn't stay in the breakfast room where their day had begun, in the bed where she had died. I was heartbroken. I had never lived anywhere else. I was so afraid I would forget my mother by not living in that house. Now I finally understood. And almost as soon as I put the Concord house on the market, a buyer was found, and then the painful process of downsizing began, deciding most importantly what books to take, the most immediate challenge. Even after squeezing bookshelves into every available wall of my 3-bedroom city apartment, I could accommodate only several thousand books. What to do with the remainder was a problem miraculously solved when the Concord Public Library came to me with a proposal to take the thousands of volumes I couldn't bring with me. They would create a room, a Goodwin room, side by side with rooms and artifacts relating to Emerson, Thoreau, and Alcott. If only Dick could have seen this room before he died, a bustling community space now where people from our town and beyond assemble, where high school students gather for projects in the afternoons, where there are lectures and poetry readings at night. Inscribed with raised letters across the front wall, high above a small stage, appear the words Dick had written for Lyndon Johnson's We Shall Overcome speech. So once I was settled in Boston in a condo, where my youngest son, Joey, and his wife and 2 boys also lived right 2 floors above me, I made the decision that I would try to finish the book. And I soon realized that far beyond the sad memories of that decade, the memories of the assassination, of riots, of violence on campuses, there was the greatest illumination of all of the 1960s was the impulse that led tens of thousands of people to join the Peace Corps, to participate in sit-ins, in freedom rides, in marches against segregation and the denial of the vote. And when the conscience of the country was fired, long-established systems of discrimination began tumbling down. It is my hope that by looking again at the 1960s, we can see what historic opportunities were seized, what chances were lost. We can see what light these years held and cast upon our own fractured time. For in the end, in all the dark moments, it was a passionate time, as Dick liked to say, when individuals were powered by the conviction that they could make a difference. And to live in that belief, he thought, is to be most authentically alive. He spoke of this in one of the last pieces that he wrote. We may be in a time of darkening anxiety now, he wrote, of growing rage and ugliness, but the one thing a backward look into the oscillations and vicissitudes of our country suggests is that massive and sweeping change will come, and it can come rapidly. Whether or not it is healing and inclusive change depends on us. It will not come from the top. It will not come from a president. It will come from the ground up. As ever, change will percolate, as in the days of the American Revolution, which was won in the hearts and the minds of the American people before the first shot was fired. It will come from the anti-slavery movement. When Lincoln was called a liberator, he said, "Don't call me that." It was the anti-slavery movement and the Union soldiers that did it all. It will come from the progressive movement, which was there before Teddy Roosevelt instituted the square deal for the rich and the poor, the capitalists and the labor. It will come from the civil rights movement, as was done in the 60s, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement. And then Dick said, from the long view of my life, I see how history turns and veers. The end of our country has loomed many times before. America is not as fragile as it seems. So let me close by saying I agree wholeheartedly with Dick's sentiments about our country, and with the hope that we've been through troubled times before. Indeed, we've been through the Civil War, the Great Depression, the early days of World War II. Democracy was at risk in each one of those times. Indeed, Lincoln said that the central issue facing him when he faced the Civil War was, would democracy be able to exist if the southern states could secede from the Union because they simply didn't like the results of the election? It was fragile in the Depression when FDR was about to give his first inaugural. Somebody said to me, you know, if your program works, you'll be one of the great presidents. If it fails, you'll be one of the worst. He said, no, I'll be the last American president if it doesn't work. And truly, in the Great Depression's impact on the world at large was Mussolini and Hitler in its wake. It was fragile again in the early days of World War II when we stood only 18th in military power when Hitler swept across Western Europe. All the countries surrendering to Germany, including France a couple of weeks later. We know now how those wars ended. We knew that the Civil War ended with the emancipation secured and the Union restored. We know the Great Depression came to an end with the mobilization of the war. We know that the Allies won World War II. They did not know that. They lived with the same anxiety we're living with today. But in each one of those cases, America emerged stronger than ever before. So my hope that is thinking about the 1960s to turn our thinking around, not think about the sad things that happened, but think that it was a time when individuals were powered by that belief that they could make a difference. That's what our citizens need to feel today. We need to feel powerful. We can make this country different. We can change it. And I'm so glad that I could talk a little about this story tonight, not only for talking about our beloved country, but for letting my beloved husband come back to life as we gather here together today. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Wow.